We began fundraising and we had first close just recently in the middle of this year. And so our investors for the large part are made up, I would say 99% of our money is from investors that are healthcare or healthcare affiliated. And so we have the likes of Christian Berenbrook, founder of Telix, Patrick Davies, the chairman of Neuron, Lou Panaccio, Dr. Glenn Hafer, who recently sold his business to Helios for, I believe, $500 million.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining me in another executive interview. Today we have with us in the studio Hashan De Silva, the founder and managing partner of KPRX, a specialist healthcare VC firm that is focused on private and early stage public healthcare investments in Australia and New Zealand. Hashan, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Rhythm. Great to be here.
Hashan, let's start with you sharing your story behind the launch of your fund. Specifically, I'd love to hear about your background, the journey of launching KPRX and where it stands today.
Sure. If we start at the start, I grew up in Melbourne. I moved to Sydney for med school, and I realized kind of very early on that I didn't want to practice medicine. And so from med school, I went and worked at a big drug company called Eli Lilly. And while I was at Lilly, we did a few things that got me very interested in venture. One thing in particular was that we acquired a drug from a small Aussie company, and then I was on the team that launched that drug into Australia. And I really had my light bulb moment of I finally knew kind of what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I quit Lilly, went back to uni, I did a Master of Finance, I did the CFA, and then I worked at Macquarie Bank and CLSA, two investment banks, as a healthcare analyst. And then while I was there, I made some kind of big calls on companies like Telix, companies like Mesoblast, and that got the attention of a fund out of Hong Kong called Carspeak. And so Carspeak invests across Asia Pacific, in three different verticals. I came aboard as the head of healthcare to really run their healthcare investing franchise. And so we had a very good run on the healthcare portfolio. We were in some pretty big exits, the most notable being Neuron. And with those big exits, the founder of Carspeak effectively decided to return capital back to his investors, relocate his family from Hong Kong back to the US, and then he provided me with seed capital to start KPRX. So that's kind of how we got here. And so what we're doing at KPRX is very, very similar to what we did at Carspeak. So in terms of on the healthcare side, in terms of the investing mandate, the type of companies we look at, very, very similar. So we're looking to replicate that success that we had at Carspeak at KPRX. And so where are we today as a fund? We had first close recently. We've closed on 3 investments. And what we're really trying to do is we're looking to invest in biotech, medtech, medical devices, mostly in Australia and New Zealand. We have the ability to invest globally, but we really want to just focus on the core markets where we have, I guess, the best deal flow. And the key difference between us and other funds in Australia and New Zealand is we don't invest very, very early. We don't invest in science projects. So we're looking to come into a company, for a drug company around the phase 2 stage, for a medical device company, usually after approval, and trying to assist that company go from where they are to commercial validation or commercial success. And so we try to be the last or the second last money into the company before exit.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing your journey with us, Hashan. KPRX focuses on the Australian and New Zealand healthcare sector. So for our audience, can you elaborate on the unique advantages that this market offers, particularly in terms of valuation arbitrage compared to the US market?
Yeah, great. So why don't I start discussing, I guess, more the market more broadly and the advantages there, and I'll focus on our particular area of the market that we focus on, the valuation, attractiveness and arbitrage. So at the top level, one of the things that make Australia very, very attractive is the federal government's R&D rebate. And so what that effectively means is that if I have a company that needs to raise $10 million for a clinical trial, or a clinical trial costs $10 million, they only actually have to raise about $4.5 million because the federal government pays for the remainder. And when I speak to US investors, US LPs, they're kind of amazed by that, and they say, well, that's incredible. We're one of the very, very few countries in the world that does that, and we're actually the most generous. We have the most generous rebate in the world. In addition to that, our regulatory framework for getting a drug into or a medical device into clinical trials is far less stringent than the US. So in the US, you have to go through a centralized process with the FDA called getting an IND approved. And that process involves a checkbox with manufacturing and a checklist with the kind of animal toxicology trials. And we don't have to do any of that in Australia. And so the cost saving to our companies, I mean, if it's a cell and gene therapy company, the cost savings are often in the tens of millions, right? If you don't have to do, GMP manufacturing and 9-month or 12-month, toxicology trials in 2 species, that is a huge dollar saving and a cost saving. And so in Australia, you have to notify the TGA under the CTN system, but then you go side by side, and there's an individualized ethics approval where the site looks at the risk to the patient as well as the benefit to the patient, and it's much easier to get the drug into clinical trials. So that's a further cost saving. And then tactically, really down to the kind of nitty gritty of running a clinical trial, a CT scan in Australia is a quarter the cost in the US. An MRI is maybe a tenth the cost in the US. So the actual running of the clinical trial is a lot cheaper in Australia than it is in the US. But we have an ethnically diverse population that mirrors much of the US, that mirrors much of Western Europe. And so there are countries probably out there that can do clinical trials cheaper than us, but often those countries have a very homogeneous population. And you cannot get that ethnic diversity that you need that the FDA needs to see in order for your data to be valid for the FDA. And so that means that if I'm looking at a company, if you discuss it on kind of a purchasing power basis, an Australian company can get to the same stage a US company can get, often for 20% of the cost. So if you put it in another framework, an Aussie company can do it for $10 million when a US company would need 50. And that is that's a big saving for a VC. So when I'm a VC in Australia, I don't have to pay for very, very expensive manufacturing trials or these GLP animal toxicology trials that don't actually de-risk the investment or add any value really. It's just it's a process you need to do in order to start human trials. On the valuation front, what we were discussing earlier, in the US, there are thousands of VC funds that compete for deal flow up and down the supply chain. And so if you're investing at the stage of a company that I'm investing at, the valuations are often 500 mil, a billion, and the uplift that you get from investing at that stage, the Series B stage, to exit is about 3 to 5x usually, right? But in Australia, you can invest in that stage company for the same valuation you would get a pre-seed stage company in the US. So what we've been able to demonstrate at Cast Peak is that we can invest in these companies, take substantially less risk, have only a 3 to 4 to 5 year time to exit versus 15 years if you're investing in pre-seed stage companies, and still get the 20, 30x upside that you see if you're a pre-seed investor in the US. And to use kind of an example, I'll use 2 examples that your viewers might be familiar with. So Neuron, we invested in Neuron in March 2020. The company had been listed since 2005, had been in existence since 1995. We invested in 2020 for about a $70 million enterprise value. The company had already done a phase 2B randomized controlled trial. They did a trial comparing their drug to placebo that showed that their drug worked. They'd already partnered their drug to a multi-billion-dollar US NASDAQ-listed company that was funding all future development. And we got all of that for 70 mil EV. And that US company was funding all future development. So the risk for us was very, very low. And so subsequent to our investment, the phase 3 trial was positive. The FDA approved the drug. The drug is now selling on market, and Neuron is now post-revenue a profitable business. And so that valuation has gone from a 70 mil EV to a multi-billion-dollar market cap on the ASX. Telix as well, they listed on the ASX at I believe 60 or 70 cent share price. And at that stage, the de-risking for the prostate cancer diagnostic had largely been done. They were actually listing to file with the FDA and get approved. So subsequent to listing, they went from 70 cents, the product's been approved. They just announced a quarterly with about 200 million in revenue, 200 mil Aussie in revenue, a profitable business, guiding to over 500 mil for the calendar year. And that's gone from a very, very small business, 70 cent share price, to $21. And that's all happened in the process of a very short period of time and very low risk for the investor. And nearly every single investment that we've done at Cast Peak, and I think actually every single investment, we've done for a valuation below what the company has raised to get there. So Neuron as a listed company had raised 100 mil to get to that stage. And we were in an EV of 70. So you don't get this valuation dynamics in the US. The US is a far more efficient market. But when you're looking to exit, the natural question is, well, is your exit multiples lower? But when you're looking to exit, the acquirers of these companies are the same people, right? Yeah. The same multinational big pharma companies, European and US. interestingly as well, on the ASX, when we're looking to list medtech companies, we find that a medtech company with high revenue growth actually trades at a premium to the Nasdaq. And there are examples of that, right? I mean, Pro Medicus, WiseTech, they've been expensive for a decade, and they just don't. People have been trying to short it. People have been saying that they're expensive, but the simple fact of the matter is, if you're an ASX investor, you don't have very many places to go for high value growth with barriers to entry and moats and all that stuff. So these companies tend to stay expensive versus the US peers for a very, very long time. I mean, Cochlear has been expensive for 15 years. CSL has been expensive for since the turn of the century. And so these are these dynamics that we play with that have been very beneficial to us while I was an investor at Carspeak, and we intend on exploiting those kind of market inefficiencies as KPRX.
That's wonderful, Hashan. Truly fascinating, and you can see that there is definitely a real opportunity there. So now you have a distinctive model that uses a dynamic network of key opinion leaders rather than a static advisory board. So how does this enhance your due diligence process and ultimately benefit investors?
Yeah, so I mean, the reason why we don't have a static advisory board is I don't believe you can create a group of people within a firm that can answer every single question that you would ever need to have answered in the field of medicine. I just don't think it's possible. And so what we did at Carspeak and what we'll continue to do at KPRX is that we look to go out to the experts in the ground that are treating the patients, that are the competitors, the customers, the suppliers, and we speak to dozens and dozens of people, and then we create a group of 5 to 10 people that we think can support us through the investment DD, but also supporting the company and then subsequently the exit. And I'll use Neuron as an example, right? Because it's a company that I'm sure your viewers are familiar with. Its drug treats a ultra-rare neurodevelopmental disorder called Rett syndrome. About 10,000 patients in the US. Now, if I had a neurologist on my advisory board, likely he would never have heard of Rett syndrome. He certainly wouldn't have treated a patient with Rett syndrome. And so in that situation, having an internal static advisory board is useless. Often, I've actually seen personally where this kind of advisory board actually detracts value, where you're paying people for advice, and so they feel obligated to give advice even though they're not the experts. Right. And so with Neuron, we went out, we spoke to all the centers of excellence, we spoke to the researchers in researching the competing therapies. I flew over the US a few times. One time I even went to a conference for parents, and there we saw the parents, we saw the daughters, we saw the nurses, the speech pathologists, the physiotherapists, everyone in the care continuum. And from that, we created a group, I'd say about 6 people that we went to regularly to inform our decision-making when we decided to invest, but also subsequent to that. And this advisory board, this flexible advisory board, or this kind of group of KOLs, is very important, not only when we decide when we invest, but also when we exit. And what I mean by that is, so for instance, we were starting to get feedback from our advisors, I would say in probably March, April this year, that patients were really struggling with diarrhea. The parents were getting concerned. They were all... And then suddenly our views on what we thought, peak penetration or peak revenue growth changed based on that feedback. And we're able to act very quickly on that feedback. Avita as another example, we bought at about $1, Carspeak bought at about $1 and exited somewhere between $15 and $18. And the reason for that is before Carspeak invested, they had done a quantitative survey of 50 burn centers in the US out of a possible 200. So they understood the total addressable market, they understood the ramp, understood how quickly that you could get to peak revenue and what that looked like. And we actually had a view internally that we didn't think that Avita could get to break even on just that one indication. And when the management team were raising money and increasing the cost base, and the stock price was going way ahead of what we thought the addressable market was, we exited. And we actually sold 20% of the company in block trades to other institutional investors. So smart money going to other smart money. And after we exited, I think less than a year later, the stock price was back down to $2. And the reason for that is they couldn't get to break even on that one indication. They had to do indication expansion. But you can see that value that we generate from speaking to people that are actually out there on the ground treating the patients rather than trying to create an internal advisory board.
Yeah, absolutely. Very key points you've raised there, Hashan. Now let's talk about your current market landscape. So given the market conditions, which are particularly in the biotech and medtech space, how is KPRX positioned to capitalize on potentially undervalued opportunities?
The current market landscape. We've seen the valuations have fallen pretty much in 2022, 2023. Valuations started to really fall in the biotech, private and public in Australia. But we really, particularly in the private space, really haven't seen a recovery. And it's hard to say why that is. I mean, we've seen a bit of a recovery in the US. So this bear market that we've had now is the longest and the deepest bear market in biotech valuations ever. And so it's now dwarfed dwarfed is the wrong word, but it is deeper and longer than the 01 genomics bubble, which coincided with the dot-com bubble as well. And in the Australian market, we actually have less capital today than we did 3 years ago. So there were a few healthcare funds out there active in the space, and a few of those have fully deployed their capital and have not been able to raise a new fund. We recently saw another healthcare investor make people redundant. And so there's actually less capital today. So in the kind of the age-old adage of buy low, sell high, this is when people should be increasing their allocation to biotech. This is the low part of the market. But I guess what I found throughout this capital raise is that people generally, they think they want to buy low and sell high, but actually most people want to buy high and sell higher. So when the market is ripping and going up, they can't wait, people are throwing money into the market. But when there's a kind of a detraction, people are a bit more hesitant. And so in this market where our deal flow is incredible, we see nearly every single deal that happens in Australia passively without having to do anything. They kind of come to our inbox. That is being built through, 7-8 years of being in the market as a healthcare investor. And so and because of the lack of competition, I mean, we've never, throughout my career, ever had a competing term sheet submitted where we had to suddenly make a decision faster than we were comfortable making. And this market, that's even less likely to happen. And so we're able to very diligently, at our own pace, complete our DD, submit a term sheet that we believe is fair, but also very attractive to our investors, and then help the company kind of get from where it is to where it's going. There's very limited competition. Actually, it's a very cooperative market. I speak to the other healthcare investors weekly, and we're always looking to syndicate on deals.
Amazing. Well, it sounds like you're very well positioned to take advantage of the current market dynamics. So that is wonderful. Now, interesting aspect of your fund is its flexibility. So your fund has the ability to invest in both public and private companies. So how do you balance this dual focus, and what advantages does it offer to investors?
Yeah, so the companies, as we were talking about before, there's a very limited capital for biotech companies, particularly on the private side. So this idiosyncrasy in Australia is that companies list way earlier than they would in the NASDAQ. And the reason for that is, they just can't find private capital. So that's the only place that they can go is to list. So they wait for an IPO window to open and they raise capital then. And so the companies that we invest in, private and public, they're identical. Same stage of development, same risks. It just one happens to have a listed stock price. But because the stock is so illiquid, there is no price discovery, right? If someone actually wanted to buy or sell, the price would change materially. And so we don't view a public or private investment any differently. The same DD, the same amount of work, the same hurdles to get in the fund, the same kind of time to exit, but one of them just happens to have a listed stock price. Now, and so we don't want to arbitrarily close ourselves off to a part of the market that has pretty attractive companies that can give you venture-like returns. I mean, we just described Neuron in less than 3 years, 20 plus X return to us. Avita was I think it was 18 months, it was 15X return, and 5X on genetic signatures. Viralytics, Carspeak was one of the largest, I think actually the largest investment in Viralytics, and that was like less than a year, and that was I think a 5X return. So there are a lot of venture-like returns available on the ASX. There is some benefit of liquidity being a listed company, particularly when you go from R&D to commercial. So if you look at Neuron, it went from trading $5,000-$10,000 a day to many, many millions. So as the company gets bigger, as you go from 50 million into the 300, into the 200, your liquidity goes up with that. And that allows us to exit without having to without it being too troublesome. But really, we don't look at the companies any differently. But the other angle, I think it makes us more attractive to private companies because we don't look at an IPO as a potential exit. So we can potentially invest more in an IPO, we can invest subsequent to the IPO, and sometimes for our investors, more value is derived post-listing. So, we might get good returns to listing, and if we believe that there is another 5X to come, we are not forced to exit at IPO. And so it's that flexibility that I think it works really well for our investors.
Yeah, absolutely. And that flexibility certainly seems to open up a lot of opportunities for KPRX. Now, Hassan, looking at the broader landscape, how do you see the funding gap for later stage healthcare opportunities in Australia and New Zealand? And how does this create opportunities for KPRX and your investors?
Yeah, so the funding gap is it's worse today than it was a few years ago. And what we found is, companies, so we launched the fund in April last year. We had first close recently. And companies that I met in, let's say, June last year that needed money, they still haven't been able to raise. And so it is very dire. Someone described it to me as a nuclear winter, so that the nuclear bombs went off in 2022, and now you can go walking around, but everything's dead, which places us really well to negotiate. I mean, I found in 2022 in particular there was a big gap between what investors are willing to pay and what management teams expected or founders expected. That gap is now completely closed. And so when we go to these companies, they're very open to doing a down round. We're looking at a company at the moment that did their last fundraising round was 2021, 180 mil post money, and we're discussing a 40 mil pre-money in this round. So that's a company that's gone from pre-revenue to post-revenue, that has done everything that they said they have to do, but the market is different. And so that places our investors in a very good position. Weirdly enough, in this market, it's almost easier for us to deploy 100 million than it is to deploy 10 million. And by what I mean by that is, because there is no one else investing, we need to fully fund the company. So if a company needs 15 million to do a phase 2 trial, well, us giving them 5 million doesn't make a difference. They still have to raise the other 10. And so, if we're in an odd part of the market, whereas if we had significantly more capital, we'd be able to negotiate better deals, fully fund our companies, remove that risk for our investors, and really set these companies off on the best path to success. But I mean, I hope it will recover. I do. I think the more money in the sector, the better. But yeah, it's a pretty dire situation at the moment for biotech, medtech companies in Australia.
Perfect. Now, as we wrap up our interview, I'd love to ask you, so what are you most excited about in this market? What trends or developments do you see that you feel most optimistic about the future of healthcare investing in Australia and New Zealand?
Yeah, so from a purely, I guess, my fund's focus, as we discussed earlier in the interview, there is such limited capital in Australia for companies at the stage that we invest at. But because of all the government support, government grant funding, government programs like MRFF, MRCF, BioCure, there's lots of them, Breakthrough Victoria. It actually creates a lot of companies that graduate to the level that we're ready to invest at. And so these companies get to this stage and they've got to make a decision of if they can't raise from Australian VCs, or they're going to make a decision of do they list on the ASX or do they try to flip up to the US. Both of those processes are very, very difficult, are very expensive, take a long time, and do not guarantee success. And often these founders that we speak to do not want to list because their company is not ready ready for prime time. And so that creates this incredible opportunity for us that we can go in as one of the very few specialist investors that has a track record of taking companies from that point past proof of concept to exit, and particularly to a ASX listing. Makes us one of the investors of choice for these companies. And so it lets us negotiate very attractive valuations. As we discussed, we take substantially less risk and less time to market. And in this market in particular, specifically other markets in years gone past, this is the worst market I've seen for a company. There is less capital today than there was any time in my career. There are less opportunities, less funds, but there's still these companies that are graduating to our stage of investment. And unlike in many other sectors, these companies really can't cut costs and mark time, right? A clinical trial costs $10 million. Well, it's going to cost $10 million in 6 months, or 6 months gone. And in order for that company to develop, they've got to do that trial, right? A tech company can cut costs, cut staff, and try to find cheaper ways to get product validation. You cannot do that in biotech. So these companies have to mark time. And on the other side of it is that they have a ticking patent clock. They have a finite window that they can get this drug developed or medical device developed and launched to market. And so they do have a ticking time clock to negotiate against us for. And so what we're really excited about is that our deal flow pipeline has never been more full. And we've never seen so many companies at the stage that are investable for us, but also that where the management teams and the founders, previous investors, have kind of come down to realize that this is not 2021 anymore. They're not going to get the valuations they did. And so that gap between expectation and what we're willing to offer has kind of completely closed. And so what we're really excited about is supporting these companies and getting them from where they are to commercial success, and really validating Australian technology and taking it globally. I mean, one medical device company we were speaking to in 2021, their last capital raise was done at a post-money value of about 200 mil. And since then, they've done everything they said they're going to do. They've gone from pre-revenue to post-revenue. Their products in the market, validated by customers, which we've spoken to who vouch that this is the best technology on the market, actually the only technology that can do what they do on the market. And now we're talking to them for a funding round at a pre-money value of about 40 to 50. It's just an incredible time, best time I've ever seen to be a healthcare investor in the Australian market. So we're very excited to get going.
Amazing. And you've raised very key points there, Hashan, that I'm sure that our audience will benefit from. And your insights into the healthcare investment landscape in Australia and New Zealand has truly been very enlightening. Now, for those watching this interview, if you would like to get in touch with the team at KPRX, please see the details at the side of your screen or in the description of this interview. And once again, thank you so much for joining in this conversation. And Hashan, I wish you all the luck with your venture moving forward.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. Thanks, Rhythm.
Thank you.